June 6th, 1944, Southwick House, Portsmouth, England. The clock on the wall read 9:30 in the morning. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stood in the map room with his hands behind his back. His face was gray with worry. He had not slept in 2 days. All around him, officers rushed back and forth with papers and radio reports. Phones rang constantly. The biggest military invasion in human history was happening right now, and Eisenhower was the man in charge of it all. The reports coming in were not good. At a beach called Omaha, American soldiers were dying by the hundreds. They were pinned down on the sand. German machine guns cut them down as soon as they left their boats. At another beach called Sword, British troops were struggling to move forward. The Germans were fighting hard. The invasion that was supposed to sweep across France was stuck. Men were dying on 5 different beaches, and Eisenhower could only wait and hope and pray that his plan would work. Then a young officer rushed into the room. He carried a single piece of paper. His hand shook as he gave it to Eisenhower. The Supreme Commander read it once. Then he read it again. His eyes went wide. He looked up at his Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith. Eisenhower's voice was quiet, but everyone in the room heard him. He said, "The Canadians are through, 47 minutes. The room went silent. Every officer stopped what they were doing. 47 minutes. The Canadians had broken through the Atlantic Wall in 47 minutes. This was the story everyone would talk about for the rest of the war. This was the moment that changed everything. What Eisenhower said next to his staff would reveal something important about why a small nation of just 11 million people could do what seemed impossible. But first, you need to understand just how impossible it really was. Juno Beach was one of 5 landing zones that day. The Canadians were given a 6-mile stretch of sand between 2 small French towns. Intelligence reports said that 3,000 German soldiers defended that beach. But it was worse than that. The Germans had spent 4 years turning Juno Beach into a killing ground. They built concrete bunkers with walls 6 feet thick. They placed machine gun nests every 100 yards. They put mines everywhere. Thousands and thousands of mines buried in the sand and hidden under the water. They built walls of steel shaped like giant jacks that would rip the bottoms out of boats. They topped everything with barbed wire that could slice a man to pieces. And behind it all sat massive 88-millimeter guns that could destroy a tank with one shot. The Canadian soldiers knew the odds. Some units were told to expect 50% casualties in the first wave. That meant 1 out of every 2 men would be killed or wounded in the first few minutes. 50%. Half of them would not make it off the beach alive. The Canadians had another reason to be afraid. 2 years earlier, in 1942, Canadian soldiers had tried to raid the French town of Dieppe. It was a disaster. 907 Canadians died in a single day. Nearly 2,000 were captured. The men landing at Juno Beach remembered Dieppe. They remembered their friends who died there. They knew what could go wrong. But Juno Beach was just one small part of something much bigger. On June 6, 1944, 156,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel. They came in 5,000 ships. They were protected by 11,000 airplanes. This was D-Day. This was the invasion that would decide World War II. If it failed, Nazi Germany would have years to build new weapons, maybe even atomic bombs. If it failed, millions more people would die. The freedom of the entire world depended on what happened on those 5 beaches. Behind the beaches stood Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall. He called it impregnable. That means it could never be broken. It stretched for 50 miles along the French coast. The bunkers were connected by tunnels. Soldiers could move from position to position without ever going outside. The guns could fire in every direction. Hitler believed that no army could break through. He was wrong about the Canadians, but he was almost right about everyone else. Making everything worse was the weather. Eisenhower had already delayed the invasion by 1 full day because of a storm. Giant waves crashed across the English Channel. Many soldiers got seasick before they even reached France. The naval guns that were supposed to destroy the German bunkers could not aim properly because the ships were rocking so hard. Most of the German positions survived the bombardment. They were waiting. If Eisenhower delayed again, he would have to wait weeks for the next time the tides were right. He could not wait. He had to go now, storm or no storm. So the question that burned in everyone's mind was this. The Americans were dying at Omaha Beach. The British were struggling at Sword Beach. But somehow the Canadians broke through in less than an hour. They faced one of the most heavily defended sectors. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. The Germans were ready for them. So what did the Canadians do that no one expected? What made them different? What did they know that others did not? And what exactly did Eisenhower tell his staff when he heard the news that would explain why this small nation could achieve the impossible? The answer starts on the beach at 7:49 in the morning, when the first Canadian soldiers hit the sand and ran straight into a wall of steel and fire. Canada in 1944 was not a big country. Only 11 million people lived there. But Canada had put 1,100,000 of those people into military uniforms. That is 1 out of every 10 Canadians. For a small nation, that was an incredible number. These were not just soldiers. They were farmers and teachers and factory workers who left their homes to fight against Hitler. They trained harder than almost anyone else. They had been training for 4 long years, waiting for their chance to prove themselves. The men landing at Juno Beach belonged to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. They were led by Major General Rod Keller. He was 48 years old and known for one thing above all else. He believed in attacking fast and attacking hard. Never stop, never slow down. Keep moving forward no matter what. His soldiers learned this lesson well. They would need it on June 6th. The division had several famous units. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles came from the prairies of Manitoba. The Regina Rifle Regiment was from Saskatchewan. The Queen's Own Rifles came from Toronto. The Canadian Scottish Regiment wore kilts into battle. These men had trained together on the beaches of England more than 50 times. They practiced landing from boats again and again until they could do it in their sleep. But practice and real battle are very different things. Many of these soldiers remembered Dieppe. In August 1942, Canadian forces tried to raid that French coastal town. It was a complete disaster. German forces were ready and waiting. 907 Canadians died. Almost 2,000 more were captured and sent to prison camps. The soldiers who survived never forgot it. As they prepared to land at Juno Beach, they knew they had scores to settle with the Germans. They would not let Dieppe happen again. The beach they were assigned was not an easy target. Juno Beach stretched for 6 miles between 2 small towns called Courseulles-sur-Mer and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. Before the war, these were quiet fishing villages where French families lived simple lives. Now they were fortresses. The German 716th Static Infantry Division defended the beach. These were not the best German soldiers, but they had strong positions, and nearby, ready to counterattack, was the elite 21st Panzer Division with its deadly tanks. The obstacles in the water were designed to kill. Rows of steel hedgehogs stuck up from the waves like giant metal jacks. Wooden posts, thick as telephone poles, stood in lines. Belgian gates made of steel beams blocked the paths. All of them were topped with mines. One touch and they would explode. Behind the obstacles came the fortifications. Concrete pillboxes with gun slits faced the sea. The walls were so thick that bombs could not break them. Machine gun nests hid behind every rock and wall, and those 88mm guns sat waiting to blast anything that moved. Then came the seawall itself. In some places it stood 12 feet high. Barbed wire covered the top. Behind the wall, the Germans had cleared all the buildings to create perfect fields of fire. There was nowhere to hide. Intelligence officers told the Canadians to expect 3,000 German defenders with the artillery support. Every Canadian soldier knew this would be the hardest fight of their lives. The plan was detailed and specific. H hour for Juno Beach was set for 7:45 in the morning. That was 10 minutes later than nearby Gold Beach, because the tides at Juno were different. 2 brigade groups would hit the beach together. The 7th Brigade included the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Regina Rifles, and the 1st Canadian Scottish. The 8th Brigade had the Queen's Own Rifles, the North Shore Regiment, and a French-Canadian unit called Le Régiment de la Chaudière. They would be supported by special tanks that could swim through water and regular tanks with armor plating. Naval ships would fire their big guns at the German positions right before the landing. But the real objective was ambitious. The Canadians were not just supposed to capture the beach. They had to push 9 miles inland by the end of the day. They needed to reach the railway line between the cities of Caen and Bayeux. This was the deepest objective given to any force on D-Day. It was farther than the Americans or British were expected to go. The planners believed in the Canadians. Now, the Canadians had to believe in themselves. The night before the invasion, the soldiers tried to stay calm. Some played poker. Some wrote final letters home to their wives and mothers and children. Officers gave last-minute briefings about what to expect. The chaplains held prayer services. Young men who had never been in combat tried not to think about what the morning would bring. Veterans of other battles sat quietly, remembering friends who had not come home. The weather made everything worse. The storm in the English Channel created waves 6 feet high. Many landing craft rocked so hard that soldiers got seasick before they even left England. They knew the rough seas would throw off the naval bombardment. The big ships would not be able to aim accurately. That meant more German bunkers would survive. That meant more German guns would be shooting at them when they landed. The mood among the men was a strange mixture. They were determined. They were ready. But they were also afraid. Everyone had heard about Dieppe. Everyone knew that some of them would not survive the day. They checked their weapons one more time. They helped each other with equipment. They tried to joke and laugh to hide their fear. And when the order came to board the landing craft, in the dark hours before dawn, they climbed down the rope nets and tried not to think about what waited for them on a beach called Juno. The crossing began at 6 in the morning. 110 ships carried the Canadian assault force across the English Channel. The waves were huge, 6 feet high. The landing craft rocked back and forth like toys in a bathtub. Men held onto the sides and tried not to fall over. Many of them got sick. They leaned over the rails and threw up into the sea. Some had been sick all night. Now they were exhausted before the battle even started. The spray from the waves soaked everyone to the skin. The cold water mixed with the smell of oil and vomit and fear. The naval bombardment had already begun. Big ships fired their guns at the German positions on shore. The sound was like thunder that never stopped. Boom, boom, boom. Shells screamed overhead and exploded on the beach. Huge clouds of smoke and dust rose into the sky. The plan was for this bombardment to destroy the German bunkers, but the rough seas made the ships rock too much. The gunners could not aim properly. Most of their shells missed. Most of the German positions were still standing, still waiting. Then came more problems. The landing craft were supposed to arrive at specific points on the beach, but the strong currents pushed them off course. They scattered. Some ended up hundreds of yards from where they should be. The special swimming tanks called DD tanks were supposed to launch far from shore and swim in, but the waves were too rough. The officers made a smart decision. They brought the tanks in closer before launching them. 29 out of 40 tanks made it to the beach. That was much better than at Omaha Beach, where almost all the tanks sank, but it was still not enough. In the final minutes before landing, the noise was incredible. Engines roared, naval guns boomed, shells exploded. Officers shouted orders but could barely be heard. Some men prayed, some checked their weapons for the 10th time. Some just stared at the beach ahead and tried to be brave. One soldier later said the smell was the worst part. Smoke and salt water and oil and fear. You could smell the fear. At 7:49 in the morning, 4 minutes late because of the tides, the first wave hit the beach. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles landed right in front of a German strongpoint called Chateau at the town of Courseulles. The ramps dropped. The men rushed forward into the water, and the Germans opened fire. The machine guns sounded like ripping cloth, but 1,000 times louder. Bullets hit the water like rain. They hit the boats like hammers. They hit the men. Company B of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles took 50% casualties in the first 60 seconds. 1 minute. Half the company was dead or wounded in 1 minute. Major Lockie Fulton watched his men fall. He said later it was like running into a wall of steel. You could not see the bullets, but you could see what they did. Men dropped. Men screamed. The water turned red. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men tried to crawl up the beach. Disabled tanks burned with black smoke. Explosions threw sand and stones into the air. The sound of men crying out for medics mixed with the sound of gunfire and explosions. It was chaos. It was hell. At Bernières-sur-Mer, the Queen's Own Rifles had it just as bad. The obstacles in the water had not been cleared. German positions were still intact. Company A lost 65 men in the first minutes. That was half their strength gone before they even reached dry sand. Lieutenant Bill McCormick said the briefing told them the bombardment would destroy the defenses. The briefing was wrong. The Regina Rifles were pinned down on the beach by machine gun fire coming from a fortified house. Every time a man tried to move, the Germans shot at him. Men pressed themselves flat against the sand. They hid behind dead tanks and wooden obstacles, but there was nowhere to really hide. Engineers tried desperately to clear paths through the mines, but they were working under fire. Some of them died trying to save others. The worst part was the tide. It was rising fast. In 30 minutes, the beach would be completely underwater. The follow-up waves of soldiers would have nowhere to land. They would be trapped in their boats or forced to jump into deep water while German guns shot at them. The clock was ticking. Meanwhile, reports came in that the German 21st Panzer Division was getting ready to counterattack. These were the elite German troops with the best tanks. If they reached the beach while the Canadians were still stuck, it would be a massacre. On the German side, Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt fired his machine gun until the barrel was too hot to touch. He later said they waited for months, and now the Canadians came, and they fired and fired, but there were so many of them. From a landing craft, one sailor watched men fold up like paper as they stepped off the ram. A Canadian private named Jack Martin saw his best friend's head just disappear. Then he was in the water, then on the sand, yet then somehow behind a tank. He could not remember how he got there. By 8:15 in the morning, the situation was critical. Men were pinned down. Casualties were mounting. The beach was a killing zone. Radio messages went back to the command ships. Heavy resistance, casualties high, slow progress. Everyone was asking the same terrible question. Is this Dieppe all over again? Were the Canadians about to fail, just like they failed 2 years before? Everything hung in the balance. The next few minutes would decide everything. At 8:15 in the morning, something changed. Something that made the Canadians different from everyone else. The officers did not wait for orders from headquarters. They did not stop to reorganize. They did not call for more support. They attacked. Right there, in the middle of the chaos and death, they made a decision that would win the battle. They decided to move forward. Major Lockie Fulton of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles was watching his men die on the beach. Half his company was already down. The German strongpoint called Chateau was pouring machine gun fire into his soldiers. Every second they stayed on that beach, more men would die. So Major Fulton made a choice. He grabbed grenades and his rifle. He stood up in the middle of all that fire, and he charged straight at the German bunker. Other men saw him go. They got up and followed. They ran screaming toward the guns that were trying to kill them. It was the bravest and craziest thing anyone had ever seen. At the same time, Sergeant Leo Griepi was commanding a Sherman tank. His tank had made it off the beach and onto the sand. He could see German pillboxes shooting at the Canadian infantry. The pillboxes had concrete walls 6 feet thick. Regular tank shells could not break through. But Griepi had an idea. He drove his tank right up to the pillboxes, so close he could almost touch them. Then he aimed his gun at the narrow firing slits where the German machine guns stuck out. He fired point-blank range straight through the opening. The Germans inside never had a chance. All along the beach, Canadian officers were making the same decision. Get off the beach. Do not stop. Do not wait. Keep moving. It became like a chant. Get off the beach. Get off the beach. Get off the beach. Company commanders shouted it to their men. Sergeants yelled it. Even privates said it to each other. Because everyone understood the same truth. If they stayed on the beach, they would die. The only way to survive was to move forward into the German positions. The tactics the Canadians used were not complicated, but they worked. Tanks and infantry moved together in pairs. When a tank spotted a German bunker, the infantry would protect the tank from German soldiers with grenades. When infantry got pinned down by machine gun fire, the tanks would blast the machine gun position. They covered each other. They worked as teams. They had practiced this hundreds of times in England. Now it was saving their lives. Some small teams of Canadians did something very smart. Instead of attacking German strongpoints from the front, they went around them. They found gaps in the defenses. They crawled through holes in walls. They climbed over rubble. Then they came up behind the German positions and attacked from the rear. The Germans were not expecting this. They were facing the wrong direction. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. The engineers were the real heroes of those moments. These were the men who cleared mines and blew up obstacles. They worked under constant fire. Some of them died doing it, but they kept working. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the seawall. These were long pipes filled with explosives. The engineers shoved them under the wall and set them off. Boom. A hole appeared. Canadian soldiers poured through. When the planned beach exits were blocked, the engineers made new ones. They just kept blowing holes until there was a way through. The Canadians had learned something important at Dieppe 2 years before. At Dieppe, they had stopped. They had tried to reorganize on the beach. And the Germans had slaughtered them. This time would be different. This time, they would keep moving no matter what. Momentum was everything. Once you started moving forward, you could not stop. Not for anything. At 8:20 in the morning, the 1st Canadian units reached the seawall. They placed their explosives. They blew the gaps. They rushed through into the town of Corseul. German soldiers in the streets were shocked. The Canadians were supposed to be pinned down on the beach. How were they in the town already? 5 minutes later, at 8:25, the Regina Rifles captured the fortified house in Corseaux. They fought from room to room. Germans on the first floor, Canadians on the second. Grenades through doorways. Rifle fire through windows. It was brutal close-quarters fighting. But the Canadians won. At 8:30, Major Fulton and his men finally took the Chateau strongpoint. The Germans, who were still alive, surrendered. Their hands went up. Some of them were crying. The position that had killed so many Canadians in the first minutes was now silent. 2 minutes later, at 8:32, the Queen's Own Rifles reached the center of Bernières-sur-Mer. They had fought through streets filled with German soldiers. Every house was a battle. Every corner was dangerous. But they kept pushing forward. They did not stop. At 8:36 in the morning, a Canadian radio operator sent a message back to the command ships in the English Channel. The message was short: Juno Beach secure. Proceeding inland. Those 4 words changed everything. The men who fought there later tried to explain what it was like. Corporal Colin Brebner charged a machine gun nest that day. People called him a hero. He said no. He said he was not brave. He was angry. Angry for Dieppe. Angry for his friends who died there. That anger pushed him forward when his brain was screaming at him to hide. Captain Gord Brown said something simpler. We knew if we stopped, we died. So we didn't stop. That was the whole secret. Keep moving or die. It was that simple. From the German side, it looked like a nightmare. One German soldier said they just kept coming. We shot them, and more came. We shot those, and more came. Then they were on top of us. Then it was over. The fighting was confusing and terrifying. Smoke everywhere, dust in the air. You could not see more than a few feet. Men were shouting in English and German and French. Explosions, gunfire, screaming. It was impossible to tell friend from enemy sometimes. Soldiers shot at shadows and hoped they were shooting at the right people. The final count was both terrible and amazing. The beach landings began at 7:49 in the morning. By 8:36, just 47 minutes later, the beach defenses were broken and the towns were secured. 47 minutes. It was faster than any other beach on D-Day, faster than anyone had dared to hope. But the cost was real. 340 Canadians were killed in those 47 minutes. 574 more were wounded. Almost 1,000 casualties in less than an hour. But they had done the impossible. They had broken through Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and now nothing could stop them. The follow-up waves of Canadian soldiers began landing at 8:45 in the morning. They expected to face the same hell that the first wave had fought through. They expected to run into machine gun fire and explosions. They expected to see their friends die in front of them. But instead, they found something amazing. The beach was secure. The guns were silent. The Germans were either dead, wounded, or surrendering. The men in the second wave could barely believe it. They walked off their landing craft onto a beach that had been a killing ground just minutes before. Now it was safe. By 10 in the morning, Canadian forces were 3 miles inland. 3 miles. That was farther than any other Allied force would get on D-Day. The Americans at Omaha Beach were still fighting just to get off the sand. The British at Sword Beach were moving slowly, but the Canadians were racing inland like nothing could stop them. By noon, the leading Canadian units reached the outskirts of the city of Caen. That was their objective for the entire first day. They had reached it in less than 5 hours. Back on the beach, the scene was both terrible and hopeful. Medics worked frantically to save the wounded. They ran from man to man with bandages and morphine. Some wounds were too bad. Those men died despite everything the medics tried. Other men would survive, but would carry scars for the rest of their lives. Graves registration teams began the sad work of identifying the dead. They went through pockets looking for identification tags and personal items. Letters from home, photos of wives and children. These would be sent back to families who would soon learn their loved ones were not coming home. Engineers continued clearing the remaining mines. This work was just as dangerous now as it had been during the battle. One wrong step and a mine would explode. But the beach had to be cleared so more troops and supplies could land. These engineers worked for hours, carefully marking safe paths and destroying the mines they found. Then something beautiful happened. French civilians began emerging from their cellars and basements where they had been hiding. They had lived under German control for 4 years. 4 long years of occupation and fear and hunger. Now they were free. Old women came out crying and kissing Canadian soldiers on both cheeks. Men shook hands with tears running down their faces. Children stared wide-eyed at the foreign soldiers who had liberated their towns. Some families offered wine and bread to the Canadians, even though they had almost no food for themselves. The joy was mixed with sorrow because many French homes had been destroyed in the fighting, but they were free. That was what mattered most. The Canadian reactions to what they had accomplished were complicated. Major General Rod Keller was back on his command ship receiving reports. When he heard that his men had broken through and were pushing toward Caen, he said something that captured everyone's feelings. Good Christ, they actually did it. They bloody well did it. There was shock in his voice, pride, relief, and probably some disbelief that it had worked. Private Jack Martin sat in a liberated French house, trying to understand that he was still alive. He had seen his best friend die right next to him on the beach. He had run through fire that killed men all around him. Now he was sitting in a chair in a French kitchen and he was alive. He kept saying it to himself, "I'm alive. I can't believe I'm alive." But the guilt was already starting. Why him? Why did he survive when so many others did not? Chaplain Captain Walter Mowat moved among the dead saying prayers over each body. He had seen terrible things that morning. Young men torn apart by bullets and shells. Boys who should have been home with their families, now lying cold on foreign sand. He prayed over each one. They paid the price, he said quietly. Dear God, what a price. Corporal Colin Brebner sat with his squad. They had taken their objective. They had won. But when Brebner looked around, he saw empty spaces where friends should be. We won, he said. But look at who's not here to celebrate. The victory felt hollow when you counted the cost in friends who would never laugh or talk or go home again. The German reaction showed that they knew they had been beaten by something special. General Major Wilhelm Richter commanded the 716th Division that defended Juno Beach. His report to headquarters was honest and grim. The Canadians fight like devils, he said. We cannot hold them. That was hard for a German general to admit. But it was the truth. German commanders sent urgent messages asking for reinforcements. The reports all said the same thing. Enemy breakthrough at Courcelles sector. Canadian forces advancing rapidly inland. Request immediate reinforcements. The Germans knew that if the Canadians kept pushing at this speed, the entire German defensive line in Normandy would collapse. Captured German soldiers told their interrogators the same story. They were fearless, one prisoner said, not reckless, skilled, but fearless. Another German soldier named Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt was asked what it was like to fight the Canadians. He said he had survived fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front. He thought nothing could be worse than that. He was wrong. At 9:30 that morning, word of the Canadian breakthrough reached Eisenhower at his headquarters in Southwick House. He had been pacing the map room for hours, getting reports from all 5 beaches. The news from Omaha was terrible. Thousands of casualties. Men pinned down. The outcome still uncertain. Gold Beach was seeing slow progress. Sword Beach was okay, but not great. Then came the report from Juno. Eisenhower read it carefully. The Canadians had broken through the Atlantic Wall. 47 minutes from landing to breakthrough. Now they were advancing on Caen. He looked at the map for a long moment. Everyone in the room watched him, waiting to see how he would react. Eisenhower finally spoke to his chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith. His voice was quiet but clear. "The Canadians," he said. "Of course it's the Canadians." Then he turned to address everyone in the room. His next words would be remembered forever. "Gentlemen, let me tell you something about soldiers from dominions. They don't fight for empire. They don't fight for glory. They fight for each other, and that makes them the most dangerous fighters on earth." Later that day, Eisenhower told British Admiral Bertram Ramsay something else. "If I'd known they could move that fast, I'd have given them 2 beaches. It was a joke, but it was also the truth. The Canadians had exceeded every expectation. The human cost was documented carefully. 340 dead, 574 wounded, 47 missing. These were not just numbers. These were sons and fathers and brothers and husbands. Letters were found on bodies. Family photos lay in the sand. Wedding rings on lifeless hands. Each number represented a family back in Canada that would soon receive the worst news of their lives. But there were also moments of mercy in the midst of all that death. Canadian medics treated German wounded soldiers alongside their own. They did not ask whose side you were on. If you were hurt, they helped you. One German officer was severely wounded and treated by a Canadian medic. Later, he asked why. "Why did you save me?" The Canadian medic answered simply, "Because that's who we are." Even in war, even after all the killing, some men remembered their humanity. Those moments mattered. They showed that even in the darkest times, there was still light. The Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach did more than just secure one section of coastline. It changed the entire invasion. The success created a crucial link between Gold Beach and Sword Beach. Without that link, the German army could have driven between the 2 beaches and split the Allied forces in half. That would have been a disaster. But because the Canadians pushed through so fast and so far, they created a strong connection that the Germans could never break. The Canadian advance also created another important effect. By threatening the city of Caen from the west, they forced the Germans to send reinforcements to stop them. Those reinforcements had to come from somewhere. That meant fewer German troops defending against the Americans and British. The Canadians were pulling German forces toward themselves like a magnet. This gave everyone else a better chance to succeed. By the end of June 6th, the Canadians had advanced 9 miles inland. 9 miles. No other Allied force on D-Day came close to that. The Americans at Omaha barely got off the beach. The British made it a few miles. But the Canadians reached their Day 1 objective. They did what the planners said was possible, but barely believed could actually happen. This created a salient, which is a bulge in the front line that sticks out toward the enemy. That salient absorbed German counterattacks for the next several days. German forces kept hitting the Canadians trying to push them back. But the Canadians held, and while the Germans were focused on the Canadians, American and British forces could build up their strength on the other beaches. The numbers tell the story. The Canadians captured more than 1,000 German prisoners on June 6th. They took over 30 German strongpoints. They secured 10 square miles of French territory in a single day. These were not just impressive numbers. They were results that changed how the rest of the invasion would unfold. Military planners started studying what the Canadians had done. They called it the Canadian Method. It was based on aggressive combined arms tactics. That means tanks and infantry working together very closely. But it was more than that. it was also about giving junior officers the freedom to make their own decisions. Canadian sergeants and lieutenants did not wait for orders from headquarters. When they saw an opportunity, they took it. When they saw a problem, they fixed it. This kind of command philosophy had a fancy name called mission-type orders. It meant telling soldiers what needed to be done, but letting them figure out how to do it. After D-Day, military schools around the world studied the Canadian breakthrough. They tried to understand what made it work. The answer was not just one thing, it was training. 4 years of practicing beach landings over and over. It was experience. Many Canadian soldiers remembered Dieppe and were determined not to let it happen again. It was leadership. Officers who led from the front instead of from the rear. And it was a philosophy. Keep moving forward. Never stop. Momentum is everything. British General Bernard Montgomery was the man who planned the D-Day landings. After the battle, he said something important. The Canadian breakthrough was the key to the entire invasion's success. Without it, Omaha might have been evacuated. That was a shocking statement. Montgomery was saying that if the Canadians had failed, the whole invasion might have failed. The Americans might have been forced to retreat from Omaha Beach. D-Day itself might have been a disaster, but the Canadian success made everything else possible. The impact on morale was huge on all sides. For the Allies, the Canadian breakthrough boosted confidence. If the Canadians could break through the Atlantic Wall in less than an hour, then the Atlantic Wall was not unbeatable. The stories of Canadian courage spread through American and British units. At Omaha Beach, where men were still dying by the hundreds, officers used the Canadian success to inspire their troops. If the Canadians can do it, so can we. Those words helped push the Americans forward when everything looked hopeless. For Canada itself, Juno Beach became a moment of national pride. Canada was a small nation of just 11 million people, but they had achieved what larger nations struggled to do. The news reached Canada on June 7th. Families gathered around radios to hear the reports. There were celebrations in the streets. But there was also grief because everyone knew the victory came with a terrible price. Many Canadian families would soon learn that their sons and husbands and fathers would not be coming home. For the Germans, and the news was devastating. Before D-Day, German troops believed the Atlantic Wall could not be broken. Hitler had told them it was impregnable. The propaganda said no invasion could succeed, but the Canadians proved that wrong in 47 minutes. German morale dropped. If the Atlantic Wall could not stop the Allies, what could? German intelligence reports after Juno Beach started marking Canadian units with special warnings. One report said assault troops avoid engagement if possible. That was extraordinary. The Germans were telling their soldiers to avoid fighting Canadians if they could help it. The way different sides viewed the Canadians changed completely. Before D-Day, some Allied commanders saw Canadian forces as colonials or second-tier troops. They thought American and British forces were the real professionals. After Juno Beach, that attitude disappeared. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, sent a message to Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King. "Your sons have written one of the great chapters of this war," he said. American General Omar Bradley was even more direct. "I'd take a Canadian regiment over any 3 I've got," he said. That was high praise from a man who commanded hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. German commanders reached their own conclusions. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived in Normandy on June 7th. He had been in Germany when the invasion started. When he saw the reports about Juno Beach, he asked a question that showed how shocked he was. How did the Canadians get through? Those positions should have held for days. The Germans had expected their defenses to stop the invasion for at least 48 hours. The Canadians broke through in 47 minutes. That changed every German calculation about what was possible. The German 21st Panzer Division tried to counterattack the Canadian salient on the evening of June 6th. These were elite German troops with the best tanks Germany had. They hit the Canadian positions hard, but the Canadians held. They repulsed the attack with heavy German losses. After that failure, German commanders realized they were facing something special. The Canadians were not just lucky, they were skilled and determined and dangerous. After the war, German generals who survived were interviewed about their experiences. When asked about the most effective Allied troops they faced, Canadian forces were consistently rated in the top 3. Some Germans said Canadians were the most effective. Others said Russians or Americans or British were tougher. But everyone agreed that Canadian troops were among the very best. Eisenhower's private diary entry on June 7th showed what he really thought. The Canadians have proven what proper training and aggressive leadership can accomplish. They did in 1 hour what we feared might take a day. This was not public praise meant for newspapers. This was his honest assessment written for himself. He believed the Canadian success came from 2 things: training and leadership. Those were lessons the entire Allied military would learn from. The most important impact might have been the simplest one. The Canadian breakthrough proved that D-Day could succeed. In those early morning hours, when reports from Omaha Beach were terrible and reports from other beaches were uncertain, the news from Juno gave everyone hope. The Germans could be beaten. The Atlantic Wall could be broken. The invasion would work. Sometimes in war, success breeds more success. The Canadian victory helped create the momentum that carried all the Allied forces forward. And that momentum would not stop until Germany surrendered 11 months later. But behind the strategic victories and military statistics were individual human beings. Soldiers with names and families and dreams. Men who made it home and men who did not. Men on both sides of the battle who would carry June 6th, 1944 with them for the rest of their lives. Their stories deserve to be told. Major Lockie Fulton of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles became a legend that day. He was the officer who charged the Chateau strongpoint when his men were pinned down and dying on the beach. He led from the front with grenades in his hands. His men followed him because he gave them hope when there seemed to be none. Fulton was wounded twice on June 6th. Bullets hit him, but he refused to be evacuated. He kept fighting. He survived the war and returned to Manitoba. For 40 years, he never spoke publicly about D-Day. When reporters asked him about his heroism, he always said the same thing: "I did what anyone would have done." Finally, in 1984, at a ceremony marking the 40th anniversary, he told his story. By then, he was an old man. He cried as he remembered the boys who did not come home. Fulton died in 1992 at age 78. At his funeral, D-Day veterans filled 3 churches. They came to honor the man who had saved so many of them on that terrible morning. Sergeant Leo Griepi commanded a Sherman tank in the 1st Hussars. His tank was the first off the beach at Courseulles. While infantry were still fighting to get across the sand, Griepi was already destroying German pillboxes. He drove right up to the concrete bunkers and fired point blank through the firing slits. He destroyed 3 pillboxes in the first hour. On June 7th, his tank was hit by a German anti-tank gun. The shell punched through the armor. Somehow Griepi and his crew survived. After the war, Griepi became a teacher in Quebec. He taught history to high school students. In a 1994 interview for the 50th anniversary, he said something that captured how most veterans felt. "We were just kids, scared kids who did what we were told. The real heroes did not come home." He died in 2001, remembered by thousands of students whose lives he touched. Corporal Colin Brebner of the Regina Rifles was the man who captured a German machine gun position single-handedly. While his squad was pinned down, Brebner charged forward alone. He threw grenades and fired his rifle. He took that position and killed or captured everyone in it. He was wounded on June 8th, but returned to his unit after 3 weeks. He fought all the way to Germany. He survived the war and was awarded the Military Medal for his courage at Juno Beach. After the war, Brebner became a police officer in Saskatchewan. He attended Juno Beach ceremonies every 10 years. In 2003, at the opening of the Juno Beach Center, he was asked why he charged that machine gun. He said he was not brave. He was angry for Dieppe, where so many Canadians had died 2 years before. That anger pushed him forward when his brain told him to hide. Brebner died in 2003, just months after that final visit to Juno Beach. Captain Gord Brown led Company B of the Queen's Own Rifles through Bernières-sur-Mer. In the first minutes of landing, he watched 65 of his 130 men fall dead or wounded. More than half his company gone in moments. But Brown kept his remaining men moving forward. He led them through the town, fighting from house to house. His leadership saved the survivors and helped secure the beach. But Captain Brown never saw the victory. On June 7th, just one day after the landing, a German sniper shot him. He was 27 years old. His last words to his radio operator were these: "Tell them we got through. Tell them we made it." Those words were sent back to command. Brown is buried in the Bernières-sur-Mer Canadian War Cemetery. His gravestone bears his name, his age, and the words, "Forever Young." Private Jack Martin was 19 years old. He was a farm boy from Manitoba, who had never been farther than Winnipeg before joining the Army. On June 6th, he landed with the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. His best friend died right next to him on the beach. One moment they were running together. The next moment his friend was gone. Martin kept going. He fought for 32 days straight after D-Day without rest. On July 8th, he was wounded by shell fragments and sent home to Canada. He recovered physically, but he never recovered from what he saw. The nightmares never stopped. The guilt of surviving when his friend died never left him. His family tried to help, but did not know how. In 1956, at age 31, Jack Martin took his own life. His sister said later that D-Day killed him. It just took 12 years to finish the job. Martin's story reminds us that some wounds cannot be seen, and that the war did not end for many soldiers when the shooting stopped. Corporal Henri Poulain served with Le Régiment de la Chaudière. He was French-Canadian from Quebec. He landed in the second wave at 9 in the morning. By then, the beach was secure, but the fighting inland was fierce. Poulain acted as a translator between Canadian soldiers and French civilians. He spoke both French and English fluently. He helped evacuate 200 civilians from the combat zone, moving them to safety while battles raged around them. On June 11th, German forces attacked a village church where refugees were sheltering. Poulain and his squad defended that church. They held off the Germans, but Poulain was killed in the fighting. The French villagers buried him with honor. For 79 years, French families have tended his grave. They bring flowers every week. They teach their children about the Canadian soldier who died protecting French civilians he had never met before. The German soldiers who fought at Juno Beach were also human beings with their own stories. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt was 34 years old. He had been a school teacher in Bavaria before the war. He defended a position at Courcelles and fired his machine gun until Canadian soldiers overran his bunker. He surrendered. In prisoner of war interviews, Schmidt described the Canadians as professional and humane. He said they treated him with respect, even though he had just been trying to kill them. Schmidt survived the war and returned to Germany in 1947. Years later, he wrote a letter to the Canadian military. In that letter, he said something remarkable. "I fought you. You spared me. I teach my students about honor because of you." Schmidt spent the rest of his life teaching children about the importance of mercy and humanity, even in war. He died in 1983. His son visited Juno Beach in 2004 to honor the soldiers who showed his father mercy. Unteroffizier Klaus Müller was a German sergeant who defended a strong point for 2 hours before it was destroyed by Canadian tank fire. He was severely wounded. He lay bleeding in the rubble, expecting to die. But Canadian medics found him. They treated his wounds. They gave him morphine for the pain. They saved his life when they could have just left him. In his diary, Miller wrote these words: "They could have left me. They did not. I do not understand this war." After the war, Miller became a doctor in Hamburg. He dedicated his life to treating refugees and people who could not pay. When asked why, he would tell the story of the Canadian medics who saved him. "I was shown mercy once," he would say. "I will show it forever." That is the legacy those Canadian medics left. French civilians caught in the battle also have stories worth remembering. Marie Duval was 67 years old on D-Day. She lived in Courcelles. When the battle started, she hid in her cellar for 3 hours. Explosions shook her house. The walls cracked. When the fighting finally stopped, she came outside to find her house destroyed. Everything she owned was gone. The first Allied soldier she saw was Corporal Brebner. He gave her chocolate and water. Marie started crying. Brebner started crying too. He told her he was sorry about her house. Marie kissed him on both cheeks and said houses can be rebuilt. "You saved my country. That is what matters." Marie Duval lived to be 102 years old. She attended D-Day ceremonies until 1994. She never forgot the young Canadian soldier who cried with her in the ruins of her home. Pierre Dubois was 12 years old on D-Day. He lived in Bernières-sur-Mer. He watched the battle from his attic window. He saw soldiers die in his street. He saw tanks burning. He saw the bodies. After the battle ended, Pierre helped Canadian medics carry water to the wounded. He was just a boy, but he wanted to help. That experience changed his life. Pierre became a historian specializing in D-Day. He spent his entire career researching and documenting what happened on June 6, 1944. In 2003, he founded the Juno Beach Center to make sure the Canadian story would never be forgotten. He said once, "I was a child when I saw men become heroes. I spent my life making sure their story is told." Pierre Dubois is still alive today, in his 90s. He still gives tours at the museum he created. Some stories are about family tragedy. Thomas Roy and James Roy were brothers. Thomas was 22. James was 20. Both served in the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. Both came from Winnipeg. They landed at Juno Beach together. They fought together. At 8:05 in the morning, a German machine gun cut down Thomas Roy. He died on the beach. James kept fighting. He did not know his brother was dead. He would not learn about it until June 8th, when the casualty list caught up with the units. James Roy survived the war. He lived to be 94 years old. Every single year from 1945 until 2016, James visited Thomas's grave at the Bretteville-sur-Lez Canadian War Cemetery. His final visit was in 2016 when he was 92 years old. He could barely walk. Friends had to help him. He stood at his brother's grave and said quietly, I am coming soon, Tommy. Wait for me. James died 6 months later. The brothers are together now. There is also the story of the wedding ring. Private Andrew Morrison served with the Canadian Scottish Regiment. He was killed on June 6th. 3 days later, soldiers found his wedding ring lying in the sand. It was returned to his widow, Elizabeth, along with his other personal effects. Elizabeth Morrison never remarried. She wore his ring on a chain around her neck for 54 years. When she died in 1998, her will stated that the ring should be donated to the Juno Beach Center. It is on display there today. The card next to it reads, "He left for war 3 months after our wedding." This was all that came back. Visitors to the museum stop and look at that simple gold band, and they understand the price that families paid. These stories matter because they remind us that history is not just about nations and armies and strategies. History is about people. Young men who were scared but went anyway. Brothers who fought side by side. Enemies who showed mercy to each other. Civilians who lost everything but remained grateful. Families torn apart by war. These were real people with real lives and real emotions. When we say 340 Canadians died at Juno Beach, we must remember that each one was a person. Each one had a mother who cried when the telegram came. Each one had dreams that would never be fulfilled. Each one paid the ultimate price for freedom. Their individual stories, their names, their faces, their hopes and fears, these must never be forgotten. Because when we forget the individuals, we forget what war really costs, and we forget why peace is so precious. The Juno Beach Center stands today in Courseulles-sur-Mer, on the very sand where Canadian soldiers landed 80 years ago. It opened in 2003 and is the only Canadian museum on the D-Day beaches. Over 2 million people have visited since it opened. The Canadian government pays for children under 18 to enter for free. They want young people to know the story. Inside the museum are uniforms and weapons and letters from soldiers. There are photographs of young men who will be forever young. Outside, you can still see some of the German bunkers. The concrete walls still stand with bullet holes in them. If you walk on the beach, you are walking where heroes walked, where heroes died. Not far away is the Bagny-sur-Mer Canadian War Cemetery. 2,049 Canadian soldiers are buried there. 335 of them died on June 6, 1944. The cemetery is beautiful and terrible at the same time. Perfect rows of white headstones stretch across green grass. Each stone has a name, an age, a date. Some stones have messages from families. Beloved son, devoted husband, forever in our hearts. The names are carved on the walls for those whose bodies were never found. Walking through that cemetery, you understand the true cost of freedom. Every stone is a life that ended too soon. Every name is a family that was broken. Every year on June 6th, people gather at Juno Beach to remember. For many years, Canadian veterans made the journey back to France. These were old men now, in their 80s and 90s. They wore their medals and walked slowly with canes. French people would see them and rush over to shake their hands and thank them. Some French people would cry. The veterans would cry too. In 2019, for the 75th anniversary, 25,000 Canadians traveled to Normandy. The veterans who were still alive were now in their mid-90s. They were some of the last survivors. Young people would ask them what it was like. Most veterans would just shake their heads. "You had to be there," they would say. You cannot explain it to someone who was not there. French schoolchildren learn about D-Day and the Canadian liberation. They visit the cemetery and place flowers on graves. They learn the names of the soldiers buried there. Some schools adopt specific graves and research the soldiers' lives. The children write letters to the soldiers' families in Canada. They want the families to know that France has not forgotten, that France will never forget. The bond between Canada and France grew strong after the war. 15 towns in Normandy gave freedom of the city to Canadian military units. That is a great honor. It means Canadian soldiers are always welcome there. Schools created exchange programs. Norman children visit Canada, and Canadian children visit Normandy. They learn each other's history. Some towns became twin cities. Caen is paired with Edmonton. Courcelles is paired with Winnipeg. The connections run deep. Surveys in France show that 89% of French people can identify Canada's role in their liberation. That is remarkable 80 years later. Most French people can tell you that Canadians landed at Juno Beach. They know that Canadians fought and died to free France. That memory is passed down from grandparents to parents to children. It does not fade. For Canada, D-Day became central to the national identity. Juno Beach is taught in every school. Canadian children learn about the sacrifice their grandfathers and great-grandfathers made. The phrase, punching above our weight, became part of Canadian culture. It means doing more than people expect from a small nation. That phrase came from D-Day. Canada proved that a nation of 11 million could stand alongside the great powers and be just as effective, maybe more effective. The Canadian military still studies Juno Beach. Officers learn about the tactics that worked. They learn about junior leadership and aggressive action and combined arms. The regiments that fought at Juno still carry battle honors from that day. When Canadian troops deploy anywhere in the world, they carry the legacy of Juno Beach with them. Remember, Juno Beach is an unofficial motto. It means remember courage, remember sacrifice, remember that Canadians can do the impossible when they work together. But for the veterans themselves, the legacy was complicated. Many struggled with what they saw and did. They had nightmares for decades. They would wake up screaming. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not recognized back then. The veterans got no treatment. They were just expected to go back to normal life as if nothing had happened. But you cannot see your friends die and be normal again. You cannot kill other men and be normal again. Many veterans felt guilty for surviving when others did not. Why did I live when Tommy died? Why me and not him? Those questions haunted them. Most veterans stayed silent for 40 or 50 years. They did not talk to their families about the war. Their children and grandchildren knew Daddy or Grandpa had been at D-Day, but that was all they knew. The veterans could not find the words to describe it, or maybe they did not want to pass that burden to their children. Only when the veterans reached their 80s and 90s did many finally start talking. By then, they knew they were running out of time. The stories had to be told before all the veterans were gone. The families of the veterans carry a weight, too. Over 100,000 Canadians today can trace their family back to someone who fought at Juno Beach. Many of their descendants joined the Canadian military themselves. They felt called to serve because their grandfather or great-grandfather served. They carry the names and the medals and the memories of men they might never have met. One grandson said, "I carry his name, his medals, his memory. I owe him everything." That feeling runs through many families. The debt to the past, the duty to remember. The French people who were liberated also passed down their memories. One woman, who is 78 years old in 2024, tells a story her father told her. He was 12 on D-Day. A Canadian soldier gave him chocolate. It was the first chocolate he had tasted in 4 years. That soldier's kindness changed her father's life. Her family honored Canada every day after that. Stories like that exist in thousands of French families. The personal connections between liberators and liberated run deep and true. What does Juno Beach teach us? It teaches that preparation and training can overcome terrible odds. It teaches that small nations can achieve great things when their cause is just. It teaches that courage is not the absence of fear, but action despite fear. It teaches that victory requires sacrifice that must never be forgotten. And it teaches that war's glory is a myth, but sometimes war is necessary to stop evil. Juno Beach also teaches about humanity. It teaches that enemies can show mercy even in combat. It teaches that young men sent to fight carry the burden forever. It teaches that memory is a duty the living owe the dead. It teaches that freedom has a price, and that price is paid by the few for the many. One veteran said something important before he died. Courage is not charging a machine gun, he said. That is just training and fear and anger mixed together. Real courage is coming home and living with what you have done and seen. The guys who survived, that took more courage than the beach. Those words capture a truth that too many people forget. The battle does not end when the guns stop. It continues in the hearts and minds of those who fought. Eisenhower was right about the Canadians. They fought for each other, not for empire or glory. That made them the most dangerous fighters on earth. In 47 minutes, they broke Hitler's Atlantic Wall. They advanced farther than anyone else. They paid a terrible price. 340 dead, 574 wounded. But they held what they won. They never gave up. They never backed down. And they changed history. 80 years later, their sacrifice is not forgotten. It lives in the grateful memory of a liberated people. It lives in the doctrine of modern armies. It lives in the identity of a nation. It lives in the freedom we enjoy today. Juno Beach reminds us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, but it also reminds us they should never have to do it alone, and we must never forget what it cost them. Picture this. A Canadian veteran, 98 years old, returns to Juno Beach in 2024. He knows this will be his last visit. He stands on the sand where he landed 80 years ago. His body is old, but his memories are sharp. A French child, maybe 8 years old, walks up to him. The child places a small Canadian flag in the veteran's weathered hand. The old soldier begins to cry. The child asks, "Why are you crying?" The veteran wipes his eyes and answers, "Because you remember. Because after all this time, after all these years, you remember." The tide comes in just as it did on June 6, 1944. The beach is peaceful now, but the memory remains. And the duty to remember remains with all of us who live in the freedom they gave us.